Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Swati Biswas from the Department of Islamic History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today we are going to discuss the module, The Economy of Bahamani Kingdom. In this module, we have to discuss the polity of the Bahamani Kingdom to see how it facilitated the economy, the overseas economy of South India during the period and the role of the Bahamani Kingdom in that trade, the role of the adjoining ports of the Peninsular India, and the agricultural pattern and role of agriculture in the political growth of this kingdom. Now let us start with the importance of polity in understanding the economy. Once Muhammad bin Tughlaq abandoned Daulatabad and decided to shift his capital back to Delhi. Daulatabad was then conquered by Zafar Khan in 1345. Zafar Khan is also known as Bahamani Shah, who became the founder of an important dynasty which ruled Deccan for nearly 2 centuries. The new kingdom comprised initially the entire region of Deccan, but of course its space shrinked with the advent of the Vijayanagara Empire. To understand the economy, the political phases of the Bahamani kingdom is important to mention. The political development of the Bahamani kingdom can be divided into 2 phases. The initial phase between 1347 to 1422, the center of activities was Gulbarga, while in the second phase between 1422 and 1538, the capital shifted to Bidar, which was more centrally located and more fertile in terms of land productivity. Now, this is important to understand that as the political activity shifted from one capital to the other, the capital incentivity or the capital income of the center grew, and so did the power of the Bahamani kingdom. Bahman Shah's successor, Muhammad Shah, was killed about 500,000 people in his campaign against the enemies, and this mass killing of course had a very adverse effect on the economy of the time. Especially the agriculturists were affected in this whole affair. Despite their many wars, Sultan Muhammad Shah and his successor could not expand the Sultanate very much. They just about managed to maintain the status quo from then. Around 1400, the rulers of Vijayanagara, in a bid to check the Sultan's expansionist policy in good old Rajamandala style, which actually was a basic warfare style of South India, established an alliance with the Sultans of Gujarat and Malwa. And from hence, we have seen a kind of a political affair that had an adverse effect on the economic situation, and the constant warfare between Gujarat, Malwa, the Bahamanis and the Vijayanagar actually posed a kind of a threat not only to the economy of the time but also paved the way for the smooth entry of the Europeans into the peninsula. In 1425, the Bahamani Sultan laid siege of Warangal and thus reached the east coast, which for some times they could keep in their possession. However, only a few years later, with the Surya Vamshas, again it was a challenging role, and we see the Sultanate for its downfall. In the 15th century, the capital of the Bahamani Sultanate was moved from Gulbarga to Bidar. The new capital, Bidar, was located at a much higher level than Gulbarga and was at an advantageous position as far as its climate is concerned. However, nearly 100 miles further to the northeast and thus much closer to the region of Warangal, Bidar soon was an impressive capital that Gulbarga had been. Nikitin, a Russian traveler who spent 4 years in the Sultanate from 1470 to about 1474, has left us with a report which is now considered to be one of the most important European accounts of life in medieval India. Of course, we also have to be very conscious as to when discussing these foreign accounts, because they were unable to look into the cultural life in its true quality and record them in their accounts. Nikitin highlighted that the great contrast between the enormous wealth of the nobility and the grinding poverty of the rural population. Now, this was a stark reality of medieval India. The elite, especially the political elite, never ever thought about distributing the civic amenities that was essential to the masses, and therefore the growth of economy got arrested after a point of time, and general mass was left for subsistence. Now, this was also a reality in North India, which we see as a typical of medieval and a reputation in South. There is also a factor in economic life that needs to be understood. The distribution of wealth was dismal, and thus the subjects could change loyalty any time. So therefore, this was a reality from which the Bahamanis could not change themselves. The exploitation of the rich or the ruling class, like any medieval phenomena, was also a reality of the Bahamani kingdom till its last day. Let us now move to see one of the characters of this kingdom, the minister Mahmud Gawan, and his reforms, and that is how it impacted the economy. He was perhaps the most important personality of the Bahamani Sultanate, who served not only the sultans and prime minister, but also as a general for 20 years from 1461 to 1481 as in the capital of Bidar. He was mainly working under Alauddin Humayun Shah's reign, that is from 1458 to 61. Mahmud Gawan rose to prominence during his time. He conquered Goa, which went to the Vijayanagars for a considerable time. The Sultanate then extended from coast to coast. Gawan also introduced remarkable administrative reforms and controlled many districts directly. Now, this controlling of the districts directly definitely enhanced the central exchequer. State finance definitely was improved because of his policies. The tax structure was well laid out, and the process of measurement and tax calculation enhanced the central revenue. We have to understand that his method of tax collection or direct measurement of land was not very close to what we have seen in North under Alauddin Khalji. We have to remember that Mahmud Gawan's measurement policies were much more scientific compared to the North, but of course less discussed in Indian history. All this ended with his execution on false charges of court intrigue. With his death, the heydays of the Bahamani kingdom was numbered. The reforms of Mahmud Gawan were aimed at curbing the power of the Tarafdars or the middle order controllers of land. They were in charge of the military administration of the provinces and entrusted with the task of mobilizing troops and appointing able commanders under the direct scrutiny of the central government. But of course, we have to understand that this was also the way how the Tarafdars could unite against Mahmud Gawan. Tarafdars had a local kind of loyalty. So it is difficult for them, for the central power to control them. But of course, Mahmud Gawan, through his policy, especially the tax reform policy, was able to bring the Tarafdars under the direct control of the central administration and thereby started controlling the tax system directly. Now, this was also a relief to some extent technically to the taxpayers or the peasantry. In this task, they economically looted. The loot of the people somehow stopped. But of course, this was not for long. With the death of Mahmud Gawan, we see the Tarafdars again coming back to their position. Mahmud Gawan was also responsible for adapting revenue assignment on the basis of the measurement of land. The policy of accommodation and equilibrium is reflected in Mahmud Gawan's effort to induct equal number of old comers, that is the Abyssinians and the Dakhnis. The newcomers included Iranian, Sasanians, the Central Asian immigrants. Sarlashkars and the administrative heads was appointed from among both the groups, that is the Dakhnis and the Afakis. Now we have to understand that the Bahamani kingdom's problem lay there. The composite culture of the ruling elites could never develop. The ruling elites somehow maintained their own identity, and the whole issue of identity politics within the court brought its end. So, the Bahamani kingdom was unable somehow, or the ruling elites of Bahamani kingdom were failed to bring about certain cohesive culture among the ruling elites that their northern counterpart was able to do. Mahmud Gawan's excellence lay not only in the reforms, but he did not favor the nobility and tried to bring about a kind of a balance in the economic distribution of the wealth that the center had. After his death, the conflicts among the nobles actually reached a new height, and on the basis of this, we see the Bahamani kingdom coming to an end. The conflict now was purely based on the desire to seize power by whatever means came to their hand. The various factions at the Sultan's court started a struggle for power and ended with the dynasty itself. Indigenous Muslim courtiers and generals were ranged against the alien Arabs, the Turks, and the Persians. We have to understand that the eastern coast of the peninsula was open to all these new elements who came from the west, and they chose to become a part of this country. But of course, they also were ambitious enough to get into the political sphere, as they did in the Bahamani kingdom. But of course, the weakness of this political ambition was that they were not able to bring about any cohesive characters, as a result of which the economy suffered a lot. Mahmud Shah, the last sultan, could do little to save this once powerful but now staggering sultanate. Now let us look into the core factors of the economy. In the Bahamani kingdom, trade and commerce was flourishing from its initial state. Nikitin, again we going back to his account, says that he gave an ample information regarding the commercial activities of the capital city of Bidar. Essentially, horses, clothes, silk and pepper were the chief merchandise of these areas. Now, the spice trade, which has an ancient background, was basically controlled in South India by these two states, the Bahamanis and the Vijayanagara. We also have to understand that none of these empires had a direct link with the trade itself. Rather, they controlled those elements who were actually trading the spices. So that is, they controlled the local chiefs and also the traders. All they could provide was, they provided good roads, and they provided certain amount of security in those roads, and also contributed in this way in the commercial affair of the trade of the spices. As far as horses are concerned, we have to understand that the eastern ports of the peninsula was important because the horses first landed in these ports. The local chiefs had a total control over these trade, and again from this ports through the land route it went up to the north. Now this area, this whole question of sending the horses from the port to its destination was controlled by these political powers, in where we have the Vijayanagar playing a very important role along with the Bahamanis. Nikitin's account also talks at length about these kind of trade. Now, the industries that grew in the context of the Bahamani state sees that the local markets were able to enhance their economic role through the involvement and flourishing of industries during this time, especially that of the textile. The movement of the individual merchants from one part of the country to another and the highly developed organization of the mercantile corporations in different parts provided adequate opportunity of a brisk internal trade in certain sort of goods. Spinning and weaving formed a major industry which occupied considerable number of people, and the guilds of weavers were generally in a flourishing condition and took part in active local concerns. We have to understand that South Indian guilds were very popular from the day one. Even in ancient India, we see the role of these guilds. The guilds not only controlled the local politics, but they also controlled the local administration for their own sake. They provided a kind of security to the road and also entered into the politics of the local temples, which again had a control over the masses. The export of finer variety of cloth from various parts of the country proved by the records during this entire period. Warangal specialized in the manufacture of carpet, which was of a much sought after item not only in North India but also in Southeast Asia. The metal industry in jewellery had reached a high state of perfection during the time of the Bahamani rule. Iron was also an important issue in the Bahamani industries, as it was popular for making arms, which were of course then again sold to the North Indian markets and also outside, and it moved up to Middle East at times. It is not possible to give a detail about the transport, as the records of the internal transports were not kept centrally, and unfortunately the detail of it has not been given in any other records. There was little scope then now for the use of natural waterways for the carriage of merchandise in the interior, and there is no evidence that canals were made for any purpose other than irrigating agricultural lands. So unfortunately, how the internal waterways was operating is not known from the records, and perhaps the makeshift waterways must have died down by 100 years or so. Regarding the roads, we can say that the inscriptions from all parts of the country say that the villagers were expected to give free labor for their own road. Now, this is an affair that we also see in the ancient inscriptions. So this was a common norm that the road building would receive certain amount of free labor from the villages. The main thoroughfare during this period could have been even more than 24 feet. There was also tracks added to these roads which were slightly better than what we call the modern day footpaths, which were apparently impossible for wheel traffic. But therefore we do not know why these added roads were there with the main roads. There was regular coastal shipping, and inland merchandise was carried in carts on the heads and shoulders of men or the back of the animals. So therefore the situation was much like what was in the northern counterparts. The roads were not always safe, of course, and it depended on the political situation. If the center had a stronger build, then they could provide safer roads. But of course, as the political situation dwindled, the road safety also swiftly moved away. Now, talking about the guilds, we have already discussed that South Indian guilds were always playing a prominent role not only in the economic life but also in the political life. Merchants generally were organized in these powerful guilds based on certain commodities or artisan goods. Corporations were also made with these guilds, and they transcended the political divisions. This gave an impetus, of course, to the economy and somehow brought about a certain stability in spite of political chaos. But of course, political chaos did also bring about a problem in the guild system. The guilds played a major role in politics too. Now let us talk about the foreign powers which started gaining importance from the 15th century in the subcontinent, especially the peninsula. Information on the conditions of industry, trade and travel of South India becomes more copious and precise after the foundation of Bahamani Vijayanagar Empire, which of course attracted a lot of foreigners who came as travelers or even as ambassadors. Because of the flourishing trade or the overseas trade, the political powers came closer to each other, and we have seen Chinese embassies moving to the Vijayanagar Empire, or even the Southeast embassies going to the Bahamani empires. And the establishment of the Portuguese power, of course, brought about a different kind of a scenario to South India. The Portuguese kept their political records because they were assigned by their political heads in their country. But of course, we also have to understand that they gave information, indigenous information, but they brought about a vicious kind of atmosphere in the waters of Indian Ocean, because they introduced violence from the very first day. Now let's move to the importance of the ports like Calicut. Calicut had regular contact with the economic activity of the Bahamani kingdom, as we've seen in the Vijayanagar Empire. The rulers, the Zamorins, were very active in their political relationship with both the big powers of South India. The port was never controlled directly for long by any of these two powers, but remained a key source of income as the merchants earned directly and the rulers indirectly. Calicut, where Abdul Razak landed on his arrival, was a secure harbor for ships from Africa and Arabia. Considerable number of Muslims were permanent residents there and had built two mosques. So apart from Arabs, we have other groups of Muslims flocking to these ports. Security and justice was firmly established, as the Zamorins were able to keep a law and order situation very strong in the whole port city of Calicut. Officers of the customs house looked after the merchandise and levied a duty about 1/40th of the sales, which was very low compared to the northern counterpart. No charge was being made for unsold articles. This was also something very new. So the tax pattern was very congenial for the merchants and their merchandise, and automatically Calicut was able to bring in a lot of foreigners to their port with their merchandise. There was a flourishing trade of pepper with Mecca, and a straying vessel were not plundered in this port as elsewhere. So this security factor is also very important and therefore made it very popular. Of course, we also have to understand that the politics of black pepper also brought in the Europeans to the area or to these areas. There are more information which comes from foreign travelers, especially Barbosa, who found that trade in Calicut was very large, and on that account native of diverse lands like Persians, the Khorasanis, the Dakhanis, all came to this port city of Calicut. The Moors had governors of their own who ruled and punished them without interference from the king. So we can understand the economic situation flourished in Calicut because the politics was very well organized. So therefore, South Indian economy flourished in those places where politics was well established. Shipbuilding particularly flourished in Calicut with the teaks that were actually either imported or ship itself was being built, and it was also an area where from 16th century we have the records of ships being exported from Calicut city. Now it kneeled about ships of 1000 to 1200 Bahari's burdens were built, which were without decks and without any nails, the whole fully hull being sewn with thread. This was a technique which was very unique to the Indian peninsula. Here they loaded goods from every place, and in monsoon 10 to 15 ships sailed from Red Sea, Aden and Mecca. Hence the goods went through intermediaries up to Venice. The principal exports were pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cardamom, myrobalan, tamarind, canfasula and precious stones, seed pearls, musk, ambergris and rhubarbs, aloes and cotton cloth and porcelain. All this we have to understand were written in about by the foreign accounts greatly, especially Barboza in the later period. The chief imports into Calicut which were loaded at Judah were copper, quicksilver, vermilion, coral, saffron, colored velvets, rose waters, knives and colored camlets, gold and silver as early as 1510, that is early 16th century. Now let us see the Portuguese role in the Bahamani kingdom. The Portuguese had this time settled in an area around Cochin where they repaired their ships and built new ones is a great perfection as they could do in the Lisbon. The Italian Wertheimer noted that an immense quantity of cotton was produced near Cambay, so that every 40 or 50 vessels were laden with cotton silk to be carried to different countries, and most of these ships were being controlled by the Portuguese. Carnelians and diamonds from the city of Cambay that moved through days was also at times controlled by the Portuguese. Now, let us move to the other significant economic activities. At Candanor, which another fine large city, the king of Portugal had a strong castle and their horses from Persia disembarked. So, bit by bit, the Portuguese were given certain space within the Bahamani kingdom, to be honest. On everyone's custom duty of 25 ducats had to be paid before they could leave for 15 days journey to the Bahamani kingdom. This was also being controlled by the Portuguese. Another excellent shipbuilding center owing to timber in the neighborhood was Thermopytnam, 12 miles from Candanor. Barboza noted that wheat, rice, millet, ginger, fine muslins, calicos produced in the Bahamani kingdom were exported to areas like Shawl. A few miles inland from Shawl was a big market where they brought these goods. Caesar Frederick in mid-16th century found much silk imported into Cochin from China and sugar from Bengal. According to Ralph Fitch also, certain articles could not pass without the permission of the Portuguese. In Chal, there were a great traffic in all sorts of spices and drugs, silk and silk cloth, sandals, elephant teeth and much of China work. Fitch calls the palm tree the profitable tree in the world and notices the existence of it in the Cambay hospitals to keep the lame dogs and cats and birds. Now, it is very interesting to see that how a foreign account could go into such detail, laying everything about the standard of life of the people at large. Now, it is therefore we have to understand that Bahamani kingdom was fortunate because we could able to look into the history of its society and its economy because of these foreign accounts. The accounts of one English and two Dutch factors who spent some years in Masulipatam and its neighborhood give an unusually vivid picture of the state of industry and trade on the east coast, particularly in the Golconda region. The country was mainly agriculture in the lowlands of staple crops were rice, millet and pulses, while the dye crops like indigo and shea roots were also produced for weaving industry. Tobacco was produced mainly for export and was introduced in the 16th century. Cotton was not grown extensively but was brought from the interiors. The chief mineral was iron and steel of high quality, manufactured some distance inland and exported from Masulipatam. Diamond mining had developed in Kollur. Among industries, cotton weaving stood at itself because we have to understand that cotton at that point of time had a huge market in Southeast Asia. And it was an upcoming market, and we will see later that how in different modules that how this cotton export of cotton textile from South India was actually then passed on to the hands of the Portuguese, who could then control all of the Southeast Asian ports. Among industries, cotton weaving stood therefore as first. The weavers worked in their own houses, but as they depended on advances of capital from buyers, they had to produce the quality and quantity prescribed by their customers. So the control of the market was always in the hands of the people who controlled the weavers. The weavers had never controlled the market, so the production depended on the merchants. There were two main classes of cotton goods: plain goods like calico and muslin, brown and bleached or dyed, and pattern goods, the type now known as prints, made of either calico muslin with colored patterns produced by the indigenous process. The second group of cloth was very popular in Southeast Asia. It is this group of cloth which had the largest market, and this market very efficiently and smoothly was then controlled by the Portuguese. The main export of Golconda was cotton goods, iron and steel. The two products which were essential, we have to understand that went outside. One was the crude iron goods that moved from the Bahamani kingdom to Aden to the Middle East, and the cotton cloth that moved to Southeast. The Southeast cotton cloth, the effect of it of course was far reaching, as the Portuguese had a stiff competition here with later the Dutch. So the Dutch did not appear in the scenario during the Bahamanis, true, but or the later period, but of course we have to understand the Portuguese tried to control initially the spice trade, and then they moved on to the cloth. So day by day what was happening, that the indigenous merchants were losing grounds, and since the Bahamani kingdom or the Vijayanagar kingdom later did not have a control of the trade, they failed to understand how to stop the Portuguese from entering into the economic sphere and then into the political sphere as they did. Now, indigo was transported to the west coast and hence to Persia. Cotton yarn went to Burma, and the other minor items contributed to what was far more large export trade. The volume of import was smaller comparatively. It included dye woods, metals other than iron, camphor, porcelain from China, silk and other goods. Mainly luxuries were brought for sale on the coast, and the excess of exports was paid for in gold and silver. There was no large coasting trade northward to Bengal or southward to Ceylon from Bahmani kingdom during this period. That was done from the areas of Pulicat, and we will discuss that in some other module. Now let us look into the agricultural pattern of this period. Now agriculture flourishes with the not only the interest of the agriculturalists but also the larger economic policy of the rulers. As on date, we do not have any significant record which shows that the Bahmanis took interest in agriculture in an exceptional way. Mahmud Gawan, as we have discussed earlier, had certain interest in measurement and tax policies, but of course they never thought about giving a relief to the agriculturists. Moreover, the political squabble with the Gujarat, Malwa and the Vijayanagar, and especially the squabble over the Raichur Doab between the Bahmanis and the Vijayanagar definitely was at a disadvantageous position to the Bahmanis and did not flourish, did not somehow enhance the agriculture, and agriculture did not flourish in these areas. Much of the energy of the Bahmanis therefore was spent in the tussle with the Vijayanagar Empire after its establishment in controlling the Raichur Doab. This was the main bone of contention between the two political powers. Apart from trade and commerce, agriculture was also an important sector of the Bahmani economy, but was never a major economics factor because they were unable to rely on it, and it was very uncertain income for them. The vast majority of population definitely lived in the villages, and agriculture was their main occupation. Beside landowners, there were a fairly high, large class of landless laborers as agrarian proletariat who assisted in the operations and shared the proceeds of agriculture to some extent. Some of them were in a condition of serfdom, and all of them had less to do with the management of local affairs than the landowners. Regarding the landless laborers, we have to understand the strict caste system of South India, of course, did not allow them to have the adequate land they would need to start their agricultural affair. So generations after generation, they somehow assisted or worked in those lands which were owned by some other people. Now, the tax system, of course, depended on the production, and the system did not try to elevate these people socially. So the large group of landless laborers always remained landless in spite of any political interference or, for that matter, political change. The loyalty of the people definitely could not be ascertained, therefore, because they were not considered as political subjects of the rulers. Now, this is a reality of the caste-based system of India from time immemorial, and the Bahmani kingdoms could not have become an exception. The artisans had the shares from control of common land in the villages, which were of nature of the retainers. So the forest land, or perhaps certain areas, were there which commonly was used by the agriculturists, and the tax was somehow shared in a common basis. Now let us talk about the lands and the crops during this time. The distinction between garden land, both flower garden and orchards, in the neighborhood of capital cities, land under wet cultivation and that under dry cultivation and forest land, was carefully maintained for taxation and other purposes. Wetland being further divided into various categories according to their neutrality and fertility. Besides cultivating food grains, intensive flower and vegetable growing was for raising the commercial crops like cotton and sugarcane were also widely practiced. We have to understand that 15th century opened its door to new crops, especially tobacco. Cotton and sugarcane was already in the list, but of course it brought more exchequers and therefore encouraged by the rulers. But of course there was no policy to give them certain loans through which they could buy. But of course the local controllers of land showed certain interest because it fetched more money, and therefore the land for the cultivation of cotton and sugarcane along with tobacco increased in the Bahamani kingdom. The other cash crop which was an interest of the agriculturalists was of course indigo. Now the garden produce of Bahamani kingdom was very popular and also mentioned in some of the contemporary records, which include the betel leaves, areca nuts, ginger, turmeric, fresh flowers and fruits. And of course they brought about a big exchequer to the rulers. Now let's see how the Bahamanis as a state played a role in agriculture. Bahamani sultans knew that the prosperity of the state lies in flourishing agriculture. Of course, this was mentioned in their records, but we do not see any significant involvement of the rulers into this account. The practice of the forming of the revenue under the local officials existed in the Bahamani kingdom as in the other states of Deccan. S.K. Sinha writes that in the Deccan, during the regime of the Bahamanis, the rate of assessment was 1/6 of the total, which of course is about the general rate that we had in medieval period, which of course hovered from 1/6 to and 50% or half of the total. But of course it depended on the political scenario or the demand of the political class and had no fixed rate. Abdul Razak noticed the number of ruse merchants in the kingdoms. Now this was something very extraordinary compared to any other records. Irrigation has always been very important an issue in South India. As the North Indian context, the river pattern is very different. Here, the rivers are not perennial and they are seasonal. Therefore, in the ancient Indian records also, we see that irrigation was a factor that was a concern of the powers locally or centrally. Now, Bahamani kingdom also in its record shows certain interest in the irrigation pattern. They sometimes repaired the old dams and constructed new. But of course, no significant dam was constructed by the rulers. Of course, Mahmud Gawan's period saw certain improvement in of these dams as its functionality. The importance of irrigation, therefore, we have to understand needs to be assessed from the point of view of the political involvement. What we see is that the local caste leaders took much interest in the local irrigation. Dams with good streams and channels always was important, but of course this also had a social significance. It only irrigated those lands belonging to the upper castes, at least as the records could claim. So the distribution of the water always remained irregular to all the parts that was needed. Large tanks were made to serve areas where there was no natural stream, of course, and the proper maintenance of tanks was regularly provided. But of course, we have to understand the services for the maintenance of the dam or building of the dam or tanks were also always given by the lower caste people, and it was an accepted social norm of South India, and the Bahamani kingdom was no exception. The land revenue, of course, was the main source of income of the state. In certain areas, the desais, the havaldars, the desmukhs were the collectors. Of course, their role were different compared to the amount of tax they controlled. Desais and Deshmukh assessed the revenue of each village in collaboration with Patels and Kulkarnis and reported the assessed amount to the government. Now, of course, we have to understand that these names were introduced into South India from the north. The Tughlaqs introduced these names even in their tax pattern. So these names were introduced by the Tughlaqs themselves in South India, which were again copied by the rulers of South. Desai collected the fixed sum from the villages through Patels and remitted them in the royal treasury. In the crown land, the Tahsildars collected taxes and so on. So the tax collection was somehow very organized because that was the mainstay of the rulers. Now let us summarize as to what we have discussed. The economy of the Bahamanis excelled at a point with the increase of their political powers. The fluctuation of the income was always a reality for this political power. This was again because of the internal political squabble that the kingdom always had to face. The kingdom survived a time when the peninsula flourished in international trade. This was also the time when the subcontinent saw the advent of the European powers, and day by day the importance of the Portuguese was increased and the violence in the overseas trade was introduced, and we see that no way the Bahamani kingdom or the rulers were wise enough to stop it. The kingdom, at least for a century or so, could survive the stiff competition and was able to control the commercial areas and ports, but the decline was due to the internal strife and, of course, very, very rapid. For further discussion on the module, you can go back to the text given with it or log on to EPG Pathshala website. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.